The woman stepped onto the platform of the Gare de Lyon, her long velvet coat trailing behind her, absorbing the golden glow of the station's lamps. A porter struggled under the weight of her luggage, his breath visible in the crisp night air. She wore a deep crimson hat, tilted at a precise angle, casting a shadow over one eye, while the other gleamed with a sharp, almost mischievous light. Honey-gold curls framed her face, delicate yet deliberate, as though every detail of her appearance had been chosen for effect. She moved with an air of effortless confidence, a whisper of expensive perfume lingering in her wake. Men turned to look, not just at her beauty, but at something else, something they couldn't quite define. The train loomed ahead, sleek and imposing, its destinations displayed in bold letters: Paris, Athens, Paris, Bucharest, Paris, Istanbul. The last name seemed to hold a particular weight. As the porter reached the final carriage, he set the suitcases down with a grunt, undoing the leather straps. The bags tumbled to the platform, heavy, as if carrying more than just clothes. The wagon-lit conductor, standing by the steps, regarded her with professional courtesy, but there was a flicker of something else in his expression, recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. "Bonsoir, madame," he greeted, his voice smooth but watchful. She smiled, just a slight curve of the lips, nothing more, before lifting a gloved hand to adjust her hat. The night was thick with secrets, and somewhere beyond the iron rails, a journey was about to begin, one that not everyone would survive. The woman handed over her sleeping car ticket, the delicate paper crinkling slightly between her gloved fingers. The conductor barely glanced at it before murmuring, "Number 6, this way." With practiced ease he leaped onto the steps of the train, turning swiftly to lead the way. She followed, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor of the corridor, the air thick with the mingling scents of polished wood, aged leather, and faint traces of perfume left behind by previous travelers. As she moved briskly behind him, the confined space of the train forced her into an unexpected near collision. A man was stepping out from the compartment adjacent to hers, a broad, well-fed figure with a round, smooth face and mild, observant eyes. Their gazes locked for the briefest second. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that sent the faintest prickle down her spine before he stepped aside with a courteous nod. A stranger, yet somehow, he felt familiar. "Voy, madame." The conductor's voice pulled her attention back, as he gestured toward the open door of her compartment. He moved efficiently, throwing open the window with a practiced motion, letting in the cool, brisk air of the station. Below, a porter barked orders to a lesser attendant, who climbed aboard with her luggage, hauling it up into the overhead racks. The cases landed with a dull thud, heavier than they looked. She sank into the plush seat, exhaling softly, as she adjusted the folds of her coat around her. Beside her, on the deep emerald fabric of the seat, she placed a small scarlet case, its leather pristine, its clasp polished to a gleam. Next to it sat her handbag, carefully positioned, as if its contents were of equal, if not greater, importance. Outside, the train gave a low, rumbling groan, signaling its imminent departure. The woman's gaze flickered toward the corridor, where the round-faced man had disappeared moments before. There was an odd tension in the air, an unspoken weight settling over the train, as though secrets were already pressing against the walls of the compartments. And somewhere, buried in the rhythmic clatter of wheels against tracks, the first whispers of danger had already begun. The carriage was stiflingly warm, the heavy scent of polished mahogany and lingering perfume thick in the air. Yet, she made no move to remove her coat. The rich fabric clung to her shoulders, a silent armor, as she sat motionless, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the window, but she wasn't truly seeing. The world beyond the glass was a blur, shifting figures, flashes of movement, indistinct voices rising and falling in the evening air. Vendors weaved through the bustling platform, their voices cutting through the night like sharp blades. Newspapers rustled in their hands, glossy chocolate bars gleamed under the station lights, baskets of fruit exuded a sickly sweet scent, and bottles of mineral water clinked softly together. Some of them paused by her window, lifting their wares in offering, but she remained unmoved. Their faces were shadows, their voices distant echoes. Gare de Lyon was already slipping away, dissolving into something insubstantial, as if it had never been real to begin with. Yet, on her face, emotion lingered, a silent weight of sadness, of something heavier still, anxiety. It was there in the faint crease between her brows, in the way her fingers lightly trembled before tightening into stillness. "If Madame will give me her passport." The words drifted toward her, distant at first, as though spoken through water. The voice was calm, professional, but edged with the subtle impatience of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She didn't respond. A pause. Then the conductor repeated himself, a little louder this time. "Madame?" She startled, just slightly, just enough for a flicker of surprise to pass over her face, before she caught herself. Elsie Jeffries, that was the name in her passport, that was who she was supposed to be. She turned, meeting the conductor's waiting gaze, and forced a polite smile onto her lips. "I beg your pardon." Her voice was smooth, practiced, but deep within, beneath the careful surface, something else stirred, something like fear. "Your passport, Madame." The words came again, firmer this time, pulling her back from the fog of her thoughts. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached for her handbag, her fingers grazing the soft leather before slipping inside. The passport was cool between her fingertips, its edges worn just slightly, as though it had been handled more times than necessary. She pulled it free, and handed it over. The conductor took it without a second glance, his manner crisp and efficient. He flipped it open, his gaze sweeping across the page. "That will be all right, Madame. I will attend to everything." Then, a pause, subtle, but weighted. His eyes lifted to hers. "I shall be going with Madame, as far as Stamboul." A statement, not a question. Something tightened in her chest, but she gave no outward sign. Instead, she moved with careful ease, slipping a folded 50-franc note from her handbag, and pressing it into his palm. He accepted it without expression, tucking it away with a practiced motion, before proceeding in his businesslike tone. "Would Madame like her bed made up at once, and will Madame be taking dinner?" She answered in quiet, measured words, as if these were ordinary questions on an ordinary evening. The conductor nodded, satisfied, and withdrew, disappearing into the dimly lit corridor. A breath. She exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the seat for a moment, before rising to her feet. Outside, the rhythmic clatter of luggage being loaded had faded, the hum of the train settling into a steady anticipation of departure. The restaurant steward came rushing through the corridor now, his small silver bell clutched in one hand, ringing with frantic energy. "Premier service, premier service." His voice bounced off the narrow walls, urgent, insistent. Elsie rose, finally allowing herself to shrug off the heavy fur coat. The warmth of the cabin had seeped into her skin, but somehow, she still felt cold. She took a moment, stepping toward the small mirror affixed to the wall, studying the reflection staring back at her. Her lips were unpainted, her eyes guarded. She reached for her handbag, then the jewel case. It sat neatly beside her, its scarlet leather smooth beneath her fingertips. With one last glance toward the mirror, she turned, stepping out into the corridor. Beyond the elegant glow of the dining car, the night stretched endless and dark, and somewhere within it, danger was waiting. She had barely taken a few steps down the narrow corridor when the restaurant steward came rushing back from the opposite direction, his little silver bell clutched tightly in one hand, his voice rising above the gentle hum of the train. "Premier service, premier service." The sound echoed sharply against the paneled walls, startling her. To avoid him, Elsie instinctively stepped aside, pressing herself into the doorway of an empty compartment. The space was dimly lit, the air inside slightly cooler than the rest of the carriage, as though the last occupant had only recently vacated it. She remained still, waiting for the flurry of movement to pass. The steward hurried past her, his coat-tails swaying with his brisk pace, and just as she prepared to step out again, something caught her eye. Her gaze drifted downward, idly at first, before coming to rest on a suitcase lying on the seat. It was a stout pigskin case, the kind that had seen years of travel, its once smooth leather now worn at the edges, softened with age and experience. Her eyes flicked to the label affixed to its side, the inked letters standing bold against the faded paper, J. Parker Pyne, passenger to Stamboul. Her breath hitched, just slightly, but enough for her fingers to curl ever so slightly against the doorframe. Her eyes moved again, lower this time to the brass-embossed initials on the case itself, PP. A strange sensation crept up her spine, something between disbelief and recognition. Parker Pyne. It was a name she knew, a name that couldn't be here. For a moment she simply stood there, her heartbeat steady but loud in her ears. The low, rhythmic churning of the train beneath her feet felt oddly distant now, drowned out by the sudden tension tightening in her chest. Coincidence? No, she didn't believe in coincidences. Her fingers twitched at her side as if debating whether to reach out, to touch the suitcase, to confirm its solid presence beneath her hands, but she hesitated. The air inside the compartment felt heavier now, thick with the weight of something unseen. Then, as quickly as it had come, she turned away. Without another glance, she stepped back into the corridor, her movements composed, deliberate, but instead of continuing to the dining car, she retraced her steps back toward her own compartment, back to where she could think. Because something was wrong, and whatever it was, she had just stumbled right into the middle of it. Back in her compartment, Elsie let out a slow breath and reached for the Times, the crisp paper cool beneath her fingers. It lay where she had left it, stacked neatly among a few magazines and novels, an attempt at normalcy, a carefully curated facade of leisure, but as she unfolded it, her gaze went straight to the advertisement columns on the front page, scanning swiftly, methodically. Not there. Her fingers tightened against the paper's edge, her expression betraying the slightest trace of frustration. Had she miscalculated? Had she missed something? The thought sent a ripple of unease through her, but she quickly smoothed it away, closing the newspaper with quiet precision. She needed to think, and she needed to observe. Gathering herself, she rose and made her way toward the restaurant car, her movements controlled, her demeanor composed. The corridor was quieter now, the earlier rush having settled into the smooth rhythmic hum of the train as it cut through the dark countryside. The soft glow of the dining car ahead cast a welcoming warmth, an illusion of safety. Inside, the attendant met her with a practiced nod and gestured toward a small table, one that was already occupied. For a brief second, she considered asking for another seat, but then she saw who was sitting there. Him, the man from the corridor, the same one she had nearly collided with, the same one whose suitcase bore the initials PP. She hesitated for no more than a heartbeat before stepping forward, her expression revealing nothing. With effortless ease, she slid into the seat across from him, arranging her napkin on her lap, keeping her movements unhurried. Outwardly, he appeared utterly unremarkable, a man of middle age, with a round, kindly face, an air of mild amusement in his benevolent blue eyes. He held himself with the quiet composure of an Englishman accustomed to travel, exuding a subtle charm that was neither intrusive nor overly familiar. But Elsie knew better than to trust appearances. She studied him without seeming to do so, taking in the little details, the way he buttered his bread with precise measured strokes, the way he lifted his wineglass without the slightest tremor in his hand, a man completely at ease. And yet, there was something about him, something that didn't quite fit. The meal progressed in silence, save for the soft clinking of silverware, the occasional murmur of conversation from nearby tables. It wasn't until the fruit course was set down before them, slices of chilled pear, grapes still dewy from their rinse, that the man finally spoke. His voice was smooth, pleasantly unassuming. "So tell me, madame, do you find train journeys dull?" It was a simple question, and yet, as Elsie met his gaze, she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't the question he truly wanted to ask. "They keep these places terribly hot," he remarked, loosening his collar slightly, his voice smooth yet carrying a touch of wariness. Elsie exhaled softly, pressing her fingers against the cool surface of her coffee cup. "I know," she murmured. "I wish one could have the window open." The man across from her, Mr. Parker Pyne, if her earlier observation was correct, gave a knowing, almost amused smile. "Impossible," he said with a slight shake of his head. "Every person present except ourselves would protest." She returned his smile, though there was a flicker of something in her gaze, hesitation perhaps, or the weight of something unspoken. The conversation lapsed into silence as coffee was served, accompanied by the usual indecipherable bills scribbled with numbers and flourishes. As she reached for her bag, fingers brushing against the crisp edge of a few notes, Elsie hesitated. A wave of nervous energy passed through her, tightening her throat. This was it. She turned her eyes back to him, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Excuse me," she said, almost too softly. "I saw your name on your suitcase, Parker Pyne. Are you by any chance?" She faltered, her fingers now gripping the napkin in her lap, but he did not let the silence linger. With an ease that suggested he was quite used to such inquiries, he leaned forward slightly, his expression both reassuring and keenly perceptive. "I believe I am," he said mildly. Then with a small knowing smile, he added, quoting in an almost theatrical whisper, "Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pyne." Elsie inhaled sharply. These exact words from the advertisement, the one she had looked for, the one she had failed to find just moments ago in the paper. "Yes, I'm that one." His voice was gentle, yet there was an undeniable weight to it, a certainty that sent a shiver down her spine. Elsie studied him, her mind racing. The train hummed steadily beneath them, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks filling the silence between them. "All right," she said finally, exhaling, but her voice was not as confident as she had hoped. "I see, how extraordinary," he chuckled, shaking his head slightly, his benevolent blue eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Not really. Extraordinary from your point of view perhaps, but not from mine." Most of the diners had by now vacated the restaurant car, leaving behind a murmur of conversations fading into the distance. The flickering lamps overhead cast shifting shadows against the crisp white tablecloth, and then he leaned in, not threateningly, not insistently, but with a quiet certainty that made the air between them feel charged. "So," he said, in a voice that was almost too soft, "you are unhappy." Elsie parted her lips to respond, then stopped. The weight of the question pressed against her like the heat in the carriage, stifling, suffocating. Her fingers curled against her lap, her heartbeat suddenly too loud in her own ears. She had started this conversation, and yet, in this moment, she wasn't sure if she wanted to finish it. She felt an odd sense of calm settling over her, as if the mere presence of Mr. Parker Pyne dispelled some unseen weight pressing down on her chest. It was strange, really. She had been skeptical at first, had even considered walking away before engaging him in conversation, but now, as she sat across from him in the dim glow of the dining car, something about his quiet, reassuring demeanor made her feel safe. Elsie swallowed, suddenly aware of how dry her throat had become. Yes, she admitted at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am unhappy." Or, she hesitated, fingers tightening around the delicate porcelain cup before her. "At least I am worried, Mr. Parker Pyne gave a slow, understanding nod. He did not interrupt, nor did he press her for details. Instead, he simply observed her with those keen yet kind eyes, waiting, allowing her the space to gather her thoughts. Encouraged by his patience, she took a steadying breath and continued, "You see, a very strange thing has happened, and I don't know what to make of it." His expression did not change, but there was a flicker of interest in his gaze. "Then suppose," he said gently, "you tell me about it." Elsie hesitated. She thought of the advertisement, the same curious little announcement in the papers that she and Edward had always chuckled over. "Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pyne." It had always seemed absurd at the time, a joke, something people desperate for answers might turn to in a moment of foolishness. But now she was here, speaking to the man himself, and the unease in her heart told her that this was no laughing matter. She hesitated again. What if he was a fraud, a charlatan, a man preying on the vulnerabilities of troubled travelers? Yet as she looked at him, his composed, unassuming presence, the faintest traces of an amused yet knowing smile, she felt her doubts begin to fade. He looked kind, he looked safe, and right now she needed that. She made her decision. Anything to get this weight off her mind. "I'll tell you." A breath, a pause, and then "I'm going to Constantinople to join my husband." Mr. Parker Pyne listened, motionless, as she spoke. "Edward, my husband, works in Oriental business, trade mostly, silk, rugs, antiques, that sort of thing." He's always been fascinated by the East. A wistful smile flickered across her lips before vanishing just as quickly. This year, for the first time, he found it necessary to go there himself. He left a fortnight ago to make arrangements for some important negotiations. He was supposed to get everything ready for my arrival. Her fingers tapped absently against the rim of her coffee cup. But something feels wrong. Parker Pyne leaned in slightly, his voice still mild but edged with intrigue. Wrong in what way? Elsie opened her mouth to answer, but at that moment, the train jolted sharply, causing the delicate coffee cup to rattle against its saucer. She caught her breath, eyes darting to the window, where the blurred landscape beyond rushed past in the night. Her heart pounded, though she could not say why. Slowly she turned back to Parker Pyne. That's what I need to figure out. Elsie exhaled slowly, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. I've been so excited about this trip, she murmured. You see, I've never been abroad before, not once. England was already a huge step for me. And now Constantinople. Her voice trailed off, as if the name itself carried some weight she hadn't fully acknowledged before. Mr. Parker Pyne regarded her with calm patience. You and your husband, you're both American. Yes, she nodded. We've been in England for 6 months now. He studied her a moment before asking, and you haven't been married very long, I assume. Elsie let out a small laugh, though it was not entirely light-hearted. 1.5 years, happily. The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, just for a second, but long enough for Parker Pyne to notice. Oh yes, she said quickly, a little too brightly. Edward's a perfect angel. There was another pause. She bit her lip before adding, he's not the most exciting person in the world, if that's what you mean. Parker Pyne raised an eyebrow slightly. Not much go to him. She hesitated again, her fingers tightening around her cup. Just a little. She searched for the words. Very straight-laced. Comes from a long line of Puritans, you know. Everything by the book. Duty, discipline, order, that sort of thing. A brief nostalgic smile flickered across her lips before she hurriedly added, but he's a dear. Really he is. Parker Pyne watched her thoughtfully for a moment or two, his face unreadable. Then he simply said, go on. Elsie took a breath. It happened about a week after Edward left. The air in the dining car felt thicker now, as if the walls had drawn in slightly. I was in his study writing a letter, and I noticed something strange. Her voice had dropped slightly. Parker Pyne leaned in, listening. The blotting paper on his desk, it was clean, fresh, except for one thing. She swallowed. There were a few lines of writing pressed into it, faint, but there. Her gaze dropped to her hands, her voice growing almost distant, as if she were replaying the moment in her mind. I had just been reading a detective novel, she admitted with a small self-conscious smile. There was a scene where someone finds a clue in a blot. It was silly, really, just for fun. I held it up to a mirror. A pause. The hum of the train filled the silence between them. And, Parker Pyne prompted, his voice gentle, yet deliberate. Elsie exhaled, as if releasing something heavy, and it wasn't nothing. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with an emotion she herself wasn't sure how to name. It was a message Edward had written, then tried to erase. The train lurched slightly, rattling the glasses on the table. Elsie barely noticed. Her mind was somewhere else, back in that study, back in that moment, back to what she had read. The ink was faint, but the message was unmistakable. Elsie traced the letters on the blotting paper, her breath catching in her throat. Wife, Simplon Express, just before Venice would be the best time. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the mirror closer, staring at the ghost of Edward's handwriting. It made no sense. Why would he write this? She had read and reread the words, as if willing them to rearrange themselves into something harmless, something ordinary, but they didn't. And the more she stared, the heavier the unease settled in her chest. Now, sitting across from Parker Pyne in the dimly lit dining car, she whispered, it was Edward's handwriting. I'd know it anywhere. Parker Pyne steepled his fingers, considering. Curious, he murmured, distinctly curious. Elsie leaned in, her voice low, urgent. I've thought about it over and over, and I can't imagine any reason he would write something like that. A letter to someone, a note to himself. And, why those specific words? Parker Pyne repeated them slowly, as if testing their weight. Just before Venice would be the best time, his gaze flickered over her face, reading her as carefully as he had read the message. Elsie swallowed. What should I do? There was no hesitation in his answer. We wait. She blinked. Wait. Yes. He slid a timetable across the table with quiet precision. The train arrives in Venice at exactly 2:27 tomorrow afternoon. If your husband's note meant anything at all, that's when we'll find out. Elsie felt a shiver trace down her spine. She had wanted answers, but now, she wasn't sure she was ready for them. The next afternoon, the Simplon Express thundered through the Italian countryside, cutting across the landscape like a gleaming silver dagger. Inside, the air felt too still despite the rhythmic sway of the train. Elsie sat in her compartment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, Parker Pyne checked his watch. 5 minutes past 2. The train was running 11 minutes late. Elsie's pulse thrummed in her ears. They had passed Mestre. Venice was close now, too close. She glanced at Parker Pyne. He was watching her, calm and unreadable. Whatever happens next, he said, be ready. The words settled in the space between them, heavy with meaning. Elsie's heart pounded. Somewhere beyond the rattling steel and rushing landscape, a plan was already in motion, and in just a few minutes, she would find out if it was meant to save her or destroy her. So far the journey had been smooth, deceptively uneventful, but now the moment had arrived, the moment that had been waiting for them since the first clue was uncovered. Elsie sat stiffly, every muscle in her body coiled with tension. She felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on her, the suffocating silence before a storm. Across from her, Parker Pyne studied her carefully, his expression unreadable but steady. Keep perfectly calm, he murmured, his voice low and deliberate. You are quite safe. I am here. Elsie barely had time to process his words when a piercing scream shattered the quiet. It ripped through the train like a knife, high-pitched and raw with terror. Oh, look, look, the train is on fire. The shriek came from somewhere in the corridor, frantic, desperate. Fire. Elsie shot to her feet, just as Parker Pyne moved. In an instant, they were out in the passageway, joining a growing crowd of panicked passengers pressing toward the disturbance. A woman with a Slavic countenance, wide-eyed and trembling, pointed with a dramatic flourish. Smoke. It is coming from there. Elsie followed the woman's shaking hand and felt her stomach lurch. From one of the front compartments, thick, curling smoke was spilling into the corridor, dark and suffocating. The acrid scent of something burning filled the air. A man near the door stumbled back, coughing, his eyes watering. Another passenger tried to reach for the handle, but the heat had already begun to seep through the metal. Elsie's heart pounded. Was this the moment Edward had written about, just before Venice would be the best time? Parker Pyne didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, eyes scanning the compartment, taking in details faster than Elsie could comprehend. Something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong, and whatever was happening, it wasn't just an accident. This fire wasn't just fire, it was a message, a warning, or worse, a distraction. Elsie felt her breath hitch, and then she realized someone was missing. The conductor appeared, breathless and agitated, his uniform slightly askew. The compartment is empty, he cried, waving his arms in an attempt to pacify the growing commotion. Do not alarm yourselves, messieurs, mesdames. L'effort, it will be controlled. But the words did little to quell the rising tension. A dozen frantic voices overlapped in confusion, throwing out half-formed questions, panicked demands. Elsie could barely process what was happening. Empty. How could the compartment be empty? The Simplon Express had just begun its crossing over the long, narrow bridge to Venice. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against steel was suddenly deafening, a hollow echo of something far more sinister beneath the surface. Then Mr. Parker Pyne moved. Without a word, he turned abruptly, his face tightening into an expression Elsie hadn't seen before. Something had clicked into place in his mind. He pushed through the crowd with urgency but precision, not shoving, but not stopping either. The air around him shifted, commanding without force. Elsie hesitated only a second before following close behind, her heart hammering as he strode down the corridor, toward her compartment. Inside, the Slavic woman was sitting in Elsie's seat, her chest rising and falling in exaggerated gasps, her trembling hand gripping the edge of the table. The window was wide open, the wind whipping through the small space, cold and sharp against Elsie's skin. Parker Pyne paused at the doorway, his figure momentarily blocking the dim corridor light. "Excuse me, madame," he said, his tone almost too polite, too smooth. "But this is not your compartment." The woman turned her startlingly dark eyes toward him, feigning confusion, then pressing a hand to her chest in dramatic relief. I know," she murmured in a thick accent, a hint of breathlessness still lacing her words. "Pardon, it is the shock, the emotion. My heart." She sagged back against the seat, one hand fluttering toward the open window as if searching for the air itself. Parker Pyne's expression didn't change, but Elsie felt the temperature of the room shift. Something was wrong, terribly, undeniably wrong. The woman had fled the scene of the fire almost too perfectly, settling into Elsie's compartment with an ease that sent a sliver of ice down her spine. And that window, why was it open? Parker Pyne's voice was steady, reassuring, but Elsie knew him well enough by now to hear the undercurrent of something else. "You must not be afraid," he said softly. "I do not believe for a moment that the fire is serious." The woman's lips twitched, not in fear, but something else. A flicker of hesitation, a single heartbeat of calculation. Then she nodded, exhaling dramatically. "Ah, what a mercy. I feel restored." She shifted, preparing to stand. "I will return to my own compartment." "Not just yet." Parker Pyne's hand pressed her gently back. Elsie's pulse quickened. Something had just changed, and it was only now, standing this close, that Elsie noticed it, the faintest imprint of soot on the woman's sleeve, the exact kind of soot one might find, if they had been in the middle of the smoke. "I will ask you to wait a moment, madam." Parker Pyne's voice was steady, but there was an undeniable steel beneath the words. The Slavic woman stiffened, a flicker of something annoyance, apprehension, calculation, flashed across her face. "Monsieur, this is an outrage," she protested, her accent sharpening, as she shifted in her seat. Parker Pyne's eyes didn't waver. "Madame, you will remain." His voice rang out coldly, like a judge passing sentence, and for the first time, a true silence fell over the compartment. Elsie appeared at the doorway, breathless, slightly disheveled, her eyes wide with adrenaline. "It was a smoke bomb," she gasped. "A ridiculous practical joke. The conductor is furious. He's questioning everyone." She stopped mid-sentence, her gaze locking onto the rigidly poised woman sitting before Parker Pyne. Something felt off. Parker Pyne turned slightly toward Elsie, but his piercing gaze never fully left the Slavic woman. "Mrs. Jeffries," he said smoothly, "what do you carry in your little scarlet case?" Elsie blinked. "My jewelry." "Perhaps you would be so kind as to look and see if everything is still there." The effect was instantaneous. The Slavic woman erupted into a torrent of indignant words, switching effortlessly into rapid-fire French as though language alone could overwhelm the accusation. Elsie, however, was no longer listening. Her hands trembled as she reached for her small velvet-smooth jewel case. She knew before she even opened it. Her fingers flipped the delicate latch, and the lid sprang open far too easily. "Oh," her voice broke in a gasp. The case was empty, unlocked. Parker Pyne finished, his tone grim. The Slavic woman's rant intensified, her voice rising like a woman scorned, humiliated, wrongfully accused. But Elsie wasn't hearing her anymore. Everything was gone. "My diamond bracelet, my necklace, the one Pop gave me." Her voice cracked. "The emerald ring, the ruby ring, the brooches. Thank goodness I was wearing my pearls." She turned desperately to Parker Pyne, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. "Oh, Mr. Pyne, what shall we do?" Parker Pyne remained as calm as ever. "Fetch the conductor," he instructed. "I will ensure that this woman does not leave this compartment until he arrives." A furious shriek tore from the Slavic woman's lips. "C'est un monstre, un scandale." She launched into further insults, switching from French to another tongue entirely, words spit like daggers. slashing through the air. Elsie, still clutching the empty case, barely noticed as the train began to slow. They had arrived in Venice. The next 30 minutes, a battle of wits. The chaos unfolded quickly. Parker Pyne dealt with official after official, seamlessly shifting languages, pressing forward like an unmovable force against bureaucracy and resistance. But at every turn, defeat. The Slavic woman consented to a search, standing stiff-backed, her lips pressed into a thin, furious line. When it was over, she emerged without a stain on her character. No jewels, no evidence. Between Venice and Trieste, as the train slid deeper into the night, Parker Pyne and Elsie sat across from each other, the weight of the mystery settling between them like an unanswered riddle. "When was the last time you actually saw your jewels?" Parker Pyne asked. Elsie frowned, rubbing her temple as if trying to pull the memory free. "This morning, I put away my sapphire earrings from last night, and took out my plain pearls." She swallowed hard, her heart still racing. Somewhere on this train, her jewels had vanished, and she had a sinking feeling that this was far from over. Elsie's breath hitched as she clutched the empty jewel case, her fingers trembling against the soft velvet interior. But all the jewelry was there this morning intact. Her voice was edged with both disbelief and rising panic. "I mean, I didn't go through every single piece, but it looked the same as always." Mr. Parker Pyne nodded thoughtfully, his eyes sharp and calculating, flickered toward the small case. "And when the conductor made up your compartment this morning?" Elsie swallowed hard. "I had the case with me. I never leave it behind. I took it to the restaurant car, just like I always do. The only time it was unattended was just now, when I ran out into the corridor." A beat of silence, then Parker Pyne's voice, smooth but firm. "Then our injured innocent Madam Supervisor, or whatever she calls herself, must have been the thief." Elsie sucked in a sharp breath. "But how?" She shook her head, her blonde curls bouncing in agitation. "She was only in here for a minute and a half, barely enough time to open the case with a duplicate key and take the jewels. But what next? Could she have handed them off to someone?" Parker Pyne's brow furrowed. "Unlikely. I turned back almost immediately and forced my way through the crowd. If anyone had left this compartment, I would have seen them." Elsie's eyes widened, then she threw them out the window to an accomplice waiting below. Parker Pyne gave a dry, knowing smile. "An excellent theory, Mrs. Jeffries. Only there's one problem. He let the waters hang." Elsie's mind raced, then she gasped. The bridge. The train had been passing over the sea. If Madame Supervisor had thrown the jewels out, they'd be at the bottom of the Adriatic by now. Elsie's fingers dug into the seat fabric. "Then that means the jewels are still in this compartment." A heavy silence settled between them, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a lead blanket. Then, with a jolt of determination, Elsie sprang into action. "Let's hunt for them." She threw herself into the search with frenzied energy, flinging open the compartments, feeling along the seat cushions, checking under the carpet. Parker Pyne, on the other hand, searched in a far more absent-minded manner. His gaze drifted across the compartment, his fingers lightly brushing along surfaces. "Aren't you even trying?" Elsie snapped, exasperated. Parker Pyne offered her a mild smile. "I'm thinking, Mrs. Jeffries, and I must send a rather important telegram at Trieste." Elsie turned on him, hands on her hips. "A telegram? My entire jewelry collection is missing, and you're thinking about a telegram?" Parker Pyne sighed, not offended, but slightly amused. "Mrs. Jeffries, I fear I've disappointed you." Her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. "You can say that again." Parker Pyne spread his hands in a mock gesture of helplessness. "But you must remember, I am not a detective." Elsie scoffed. "Then what exactly are you?" His eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. "The human heart is my province." Elsie let out a bitter laugh. "Well, I was a bit unhappy when I got on this train, but nothing compared to now. I could cry buckets. My lovely, lovely bracelet, the emerald ring Edward gave me, when we got engaged." Her voice wavered. Parker Pyne watched her for a moment. Then very gently he asked, "But surely, you are insured?" Elsie blinked, her breath caught. Was she? And suddenly she realized something far more chilling. Somewhere on this train, her jewels were still hidden, and she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to know who really had them. Elsie hesitated, her fingers tightening around the lapel of her coat as the train lurched to a slow, deliberate halt. "Trieste," Mr. Parker Pyne murmured, peering out of the window. "I must send my telegram." Elsie barely heard him. Her pulse quickened as her eyes swept the platform, searching. Then Edward. Her breath came in a gasp as she spotted him, a familiar steady figure pushing through the crowd, her husband. For the first time in hours, the ache of anxiety eased. Even the loss of her jewelry momentarily faded from her mind. She forgot the unsettling words she had seen smudged on the blotter, forgot the whisper of suspicion that had coiled around her thoughts. All that mattered was that after 2 long weeks, Edward was here. Staid, straight-laced Edward, who, despite his reserved nature, had a quiet strength that had always drawn her in. She barely registered his arms around her, the murmured words of relief, the way he pulled back slightly to study her face with a frown. "You look pale, Elsie. Are you all right?" Before she could answer, a friendly but firm tap landed on her shoulder. She turned sharply, to find Mr. Parker Pyne, his face as calm and unreadable as ever, yet his eyes twinkled with something peculiar. "Mrs. Jeffries, would you come to see me at the Hotel Catalan in half an hour?" He tilted his head, his voice smooth. "I believe I may have good news for you." Elsie faltered, glancing up at Edward, who arched a brow. "What is this about?" Edward asked, his voice even but measured. "Your wife's missing jewels," Parker Pyne said, his tone light. "I have been doing what I can to recover them, and I believe I may have something of interest to share." Elsie blinked, then looked to Edward for guidance. He exhaled, nodding. "You'd better go, dear." His eyes flicked toward Parker Pyne. "The Catalan, you said. Right. I'll see she gets there." An hour later, Elsie stepped into Mr. Parker Pyne's private sitting room, her heartbeat drumming with anticipation. The moment he saw her, he smiled, a knowing, almost mischievous smile. "You have been disappointed in me, Mrs. Jeffries," he said smoothly, "but don't deny it." Elsie felt a blush creep up her neck. "Where?" she admitted. "You didn't seem very concerned when the jewels disappeared." Parker Pyne didn't answer. Instead he gestured toward the small stout cardboard box sitting on the table. "Take a look inside." Elsie stepped forward, heart pounding. She flipped open the lid, and gasped. The rings, the brooches, the diamond bracelet, the emerald ring Edward had given her, everything. A choked sound left her lips as she stared down at them, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Mr. Pyne, how marvelous, how too wonderful." Parker Pyne offered a modest smile. "I am glad not to have failed you, my dear young lady." Elsie looked up at him, her eyes bright with both gratitude and bewilderment. But how? When? Where did you find them?" Parker Pyne merely shook his head, leaning back. "It's a long story," he said, "and you may hear it one day. In fact, you may hear it quite soon." Elsie frowned. "Why not now?" Parker Pyne's expression remained unreadable. "There are reasons." And with that she was forced to leave with her curiosity unsatisfied, though now a strange feeling of unease prickled at the edges of her relief. Later that evening, a secret meeting, as the warm glow of lamps flickered along the winding streets of Pera. Parker Pyne walked at a leisurely pace, humming to himself. He arrived at a small tucked-away cafe, overlooking the Golden Horn. The mosques of Stamboul rose in the distance, their slender minarets cutting against the deepening sky. The place was nearly empty. Parker Pyne settled into a quiet corner, ordered 2 cups of thick, sweet coffee, and waited. Minutes later, a man slipped into the seat opposite him. Edward. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff. He barely glanced at the coffee in front of him. Instead, he leaned forward, voice low and tense. "How did you know?" Parker Pyne sipped his coffee, unhurried. "Your wife will tell you soon enough." Edward's eyes darkened. "Tell me what?" Parker Pyne's gaze was almost pitying. "That she found something she shouldn't have." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. A cold breeze whispered through the narrow alleyways. Edward sat back, his face unreadable. Parker Pyne smiled slightly, lifting his cup. "Enjoy your coffee, Mr. Jeffries. You may find your troubles are only just beginning." And with that, the game truly began. The train thundered through the darkened countryside, its wheels churning against the tracks, as a thin mist curled around its windows. Elsie sat rigid in her compartment, heart hammering against her ribs. Across from her, Parker Pyne studied her with quiet intensity, his fingers laced together in thought. "The curious incident just before Venice was no coincidence," he murmured, his gaze unreadable. "For some reason you, Mr. Jeffries, engineered the theft of your wife's jewels. But why?" The phrase "just before Venice's" was crucial. The timing, the precision, it wasn't random. Edward Jeffries shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. His face was pale, his fingers twisting the silver cufflinks on his sleeves. Parker Pyne continued, his voice as smooth as silk, yet carrying an edge that sent chills down Elsie's spine. "Your wife's jewels were never stolen on this train," he said. "No, they were taken before you even left London. What she carried in her case were paste duplicates, but you knew that a simple disappearance wouldn't be enough. There had to be an actual theft to divert suspicion. So you arranged for an accomplice, someone agile, precise, someone who could stage a robbery at just the right moment, and that moment had to be when the train was crossing the sea." A low gasp escaped Elsie. "The sea?" Parker Pyne nodded. "If the jewels were simply thrown by the side of the tracks, they could be found, but if they were tossed into the sea, they would be lost forever. It was a perfect plan, except for one thing." Edward swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "What?" "I was watching." Parker Pyne leaned forward, his smile cold. "And I sent a telegram ahead, before we even reached Trieste. You see, I had already deduced that the jewels were never meant to be found, and when I did, I had them recovered before they ever left London." A stunned silence filled the compartment. Elsie turned to her husband, eyes wide with disbelief. "Edward, is this true?" Edward hesitated, his lips parting, then closing again. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I had no choice," he exhaled shakily. "I was being blackmailed." Elsie recoiled slightly, horror dawning in her expression. Parker Pyne remained impassive. "Go on," he said, his tone almost pitying. Edward buried his face in his hands for a moment before straightening. "Years ago, before I met Elsie, there was a woman, a dangerous woman. Her name was Rossa. She was married to a violent man, and one night she fled to my room in terror. I let her stay, nothing happened, but later when she saw I was to be married, she saw an opportunity. She and her husband threatened to expose a fabricated affair, unless I paid them. The sums grew larger, I was drowning in their demands. The only way to escape was to find a way to pay them off, fast, so I staged the theft." Elsie shook her head, disbelief etched into every feature. "You lied to me. I was trying to protect you." Edward burst out. "I couldn't let you know, Elsie. If you knew, you would have left me." "And what now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Parker Pyne stood, adjusting his coat. "Now," he said smoothly, "you will follow my instructions. You will return to your wife and tell her the truth, or at least a version of it. You must let her believe you were reckless, but never dishonorable, because my dear Mr. Jeffries, if there is one thing a woman will forgive, it is a man who has been led astray, but if she finds out you were merely a fool, well, that is something far more difficult to accept." Edward sat in stunned silence. Elsie turned away, staring out into the dark night, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then finally, she whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive you." Parker Pyne merely smiled, his eyes glinting. "Time will tell, Mrs. Jeffries, but for now let us say, the game is over." The train thundered through the night, its rhythmic clatter, echoing like a heartbeat against the vast, empty plains. Eleanor Sinclair sat upright in her cabin, fingers clenched around the delicate gold locket, resting against her collarbone. Outside, the moonlight spilled across the landscape in silver streaks, but inside her mind, a storm raged. The letter had arrived in a sealed envelope, slipped under her door while she was at dinner. The message was brief but chilling. "The past is not buried, and neither are your secrets. Prepare yourself." A sharp knock at the door sent a jolt through her spine. She hesitated, then forced herself to rise. With a deep breath, she unlocked it. There stood a man in a dark, tailored suit, his face partially shadowed by the dim corridor lights. "Miss Sinclair," he said smoothly, his voice carrying an edge of amusement, "I believe we need to talk." "Who are you?" she demanded, keeping her voice steady. "A concerned party," he replied, stepping inside uninvited. "Let's not pretend. You know exactly what this is about." The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor took a measured step back, her mind racing. "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled, a slow, knowing expression. "Oh, but you do. The jewels, Miss Sinclair. The ones that were supposed to be lost in the Mediterranean. The ones that mysteriously vanished from your family's vault before that tragic accident." Her breath hitched. She had spent years running, erasing, ensuring no trace remained. And yet here he was, a ghost from the past, threatening to unravel everything. The train lurched slightly as it passed over a bridge, the distant roar of rushing water below. The man reached into his coat pocket, producing a small velvet pouch. He tossed it onto the table between them. It landed with a soft, weighted thud. Slowly Eleanor picked it up and emptied its contents into a trembling palm. A pair of diamond earrings, glistening under the cabin light, the very ones she had sworn were lost forever. "How did you—" "That," he interrupted, "is not your concern. What should concern you, Miss Sinclair, is that someone else knows, and they are far less patient than I am." A shiver ran down her spine. The train whistle shrieked through the night, a lonely, haunting sound. She was trapped, and she knew it. "What do you want?" she whispered. He leaned in, his voice barely above a murmur. "A simple exchange. Your safety, for the truth. You have until we reach Vienna. Choose wisely." As the door clicked shut behind him, Eleanor's pulse pounded against her ribs. The past had finally caught up with her, and the clock was ticking.